All right, so now we're going to get started in piecing our flying geese. The first thing I'm going to do, I've already cut out all of my templates. I have taken and cut down all of my pieces based on the pattern directions. So each of my number 1 or large squares for each flying geese are cut into 4 pieces, and each of the small are cut into 2 pieces just by cutting across the diagonal. This one cutting this way. Now with traditional piecing, we might be concerned because, oh, now I'm going to have all these bias edges, but foundation paper piecing is going to keep all of those locked in with the paper. So we are not going to have to worry about that today. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use my add a quarter ruler, but I'm going to show you real quick how to do this if you just have a regular ruler too. I'm going to put my ruler against the lines here. And I'm gonna go ahead and pre-crease my templates. There's only 3 lines on each of these. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do this here before we get started. And you'll see why that will help us in a moment. If I was doing a larger template with more lines, I would probably do this as I go. So first, I'm gonna use a lighter square in the middle. And if you see, the benefit to using a little light board here is that you can see the lines of where the fabric is coming through a little bit easier. I'm going to flip it over. Everything in foundation paper piecing is done in reverse. So we got to kind of think backwards. This is a mirror image of what this is going to be here. So for this, I want to make sure that I have overlap on each of my lines. And I want to make sure that I am coming here at the bottom, that I have a little fabric left at the edge there. That way I don't shortchange myself later, because these are our seam allowances. I like to use a glue stick for the piece number 1. So I'm just gonna put a tiny dot in the middle there and then stick this guy down. Again, if you don't have a light board, this is just making it easier for me to show you, but you can just take this piece and kind of hold it up to the window or to your overhead light so you can see through the paper to see what you're doing. Okay. Now, this is section 2, which is numbered 1, 2, and 3. You want to go in order. So the first seam that we'll be sewing here is the one in between 1 and 2. So I'm going to fold this back here, and now I can see clearly the area that's going to end up as my seam allowance here. Okay, flipping it back to the back side of the paper, I'm going to take one of these. I'm going to line it up against the edge of the fabric here and against the bottom here. Then, if I kind of imagine I have sewn that, I can kind of test and see, yep, that would be completely covered. A cheater way of doing this, if you do have a light board or a very strong overhead light, we can see where the fabric is lying in relationship to those lines there. Now, I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and with my paper folded out and everything kind of pinched between my fingers to hold it, I'm going to sew this here, this line between 1 and 2. All right, now that we're ready to sew, I want to talk through a couple of basics here that are important to know. I have reduced my stitch length to about 1.5 for this one with foundation paper piecing, because we are going to be tearing these papers away. Having a smaller stitch length across this line is going to make it a lot easier to tear, since it's basically perforating our paper for us. I also have switched to a clear foot here so that I can see the lines better as I'm going along. So for these lines, I'm going to imagine that my line is going all the way to the edge of the template, especially on this side, because we're not going to stitch back over there. Over here is less important since I'm coming from section 3 over here later. So my machine has a feature where it knots at the beginning. I have that turned on. If you do not have that feature, you're going to want to back stitch a few stitches at the beginning. I'm going to carefully stitch right along that line there. And I'm going to come a little bit to the edge of my section here, just a stitch or two. I'm going to back stitch here. If you can see, and that might be easier with the foot out of the way. If you can see, I've come just a little bit past that. And then I am going to back stitch here. just a few stitches. Trim. And now we can see that we have our line. It's as close as we can get it to this. And we can test this here and see that, yep, our fabric is coming all the way up. And now we're going to head back over to our cutting table. Now for my purposes, I have used a contrast thread so that everyone can see where my stitching lines are pretty clearly, but you probably want to use something that's a little bit more matched to your colors. I'm going to flip that over and we are perfect. So we've covered the paper template all the way around. And now I am going to use my seam roller to roll that seam flat. I'm doing this instead of ironing. You could use a dry iron on this as well. Now I'm going to come back over. I pre-folded this, but now I'm going to switch to my add a quarter here. We're going to just fold this back again. I'm going to get my cutting mat that I have for this. I'm going to hit my seam here. Do a little trim. And for me, I'm not worried if this is not a perfect 1/4 inch. You just want to make sure that you have sufficient seam allowance, that you're not, you know, way down here. Now I'm going to take my other piece for section 3. Once again, I'm going to line this up. I'll pull my paper back out here. I'm going to kind of test fit. Might want to shift this up just a hair. That feels like that's going to be a pretty good match. So now I'm going to take this, holding these together to keep them in place, and return back to my sewing machine. Now I'm going to be sewing between lines 1 and 3 here. All right, so we're here to sew our last section. One thing that I wanted to point out about foundation paper pasting is that we are going to look for where the sections overlap. That looks a little different on a Flying Geese template. You just have to imagine that because we're sewing all the way from one edge all the way to the other edge here, we're going to consider this the line between 1 and 3. Honestly, you could do section 2 or section 3 interchangeably. There's nothing about this that will cause any problems with your pattern, but typically you want to go in order of the sections for any FPP project. Another thing I wanted to show about the way that I can line things up is that with our paper folded back, if you notice right here, the fabric is just a little bit past where this paper is, and that's going to help us to know that when we flip everything back over, it's going to completely cover where that paper will end up. Remember, we're kind of thinking about things backwards right now. All right, I'm going to fold that paper back out. Just double check myself back here. I'm going to sew all the way across this line into our seam allowances to make sure everything stays nice and together in our final project. All right, I have my knot built into my sewing machine. Otherwise, I would be back stitching at the beginning. And I'm going to back stitch here at the end. That way I don't accidentally rip my stitching when I pull my papers out later. All right, and I'm going to, great. We've covered our paper very adequately. So this is perfect. Now, I want to show what would happen. Sometimes you're going to get a little bit shy of the paper. Because this is in our 1/4 inch seam allowance, a tiny amount like that isn't really going to be that big of a deal. We can fudge that in the final product. I will show you how we can sew our sections together and use this as our seam allowance line, and that way we can make up for any shortcomings here. But if we have a lot of shortage, you know, if something looked like that, I would take the seam ripper and rip it out, because you do want to make sure you're not shortchanging that seam allowance too much. So we're going to roll this out, and I'm going to show you guys how to trim. As you see here, we have our new line sewn. If we push this out, we can see that, yep, we've hit all the way to the edges here. So now I can, once again, gonna roll my seam. You could use a dry iron with no steam so we don't mess up our template here. And now we can trim. You have two options here. You can trim just to the edge of this line, or if you feel more comfortable, you can also match your ruler with this finished line here and use that as your trim line. And we will have a precise flying geese with nice sharp points. You do want to make sure that you are following all the way to this outer dashed line for your cut line. We do not want to accidentally shortchange ourselves when we're headed to the next step. And we do want to make sure this is nice and square for us here, so that everything comes together perfectly when we match our final block. One thing to note when you are doing paper piecing, you likely will be dulling your rotary cutter blade a little bit faster because you're going through that paper and the fabric. So just keep that in mind as you're getting ready for your, to change out your blade during the project. All right, now that I have all of this size of flying geese sewn and trimmed, my next step would be to complete the rest of my sizes, the other paper templates here. Once all those are done, I will be able to start assembling all of my final units and my final blocks. Now that we have all of our blocks trimmed down, I did want to show you a couple of different things about pulling the papers out. So I could go ahead and pull these papers now, that would be no problem. And I could sew this together by just aligning the edges just like I would any other pieced project. But I had a little boo-boo over here and I didn't get it quite to the edge of the paper. Now it's not so short that I bothered to rip the stitching out, but I wanted to give you an option of leaving the papers in before we sew the next step. And that will kind of make sure that everything is super aligned in our finished project without having to seam rip any little tiny errors you might have. So we're going to remember that this is the front or right side of our flying geese unit here. So I'm going to lay my side pieces on top. Now I'm going to flip back over to the paper is the wrong side. I'm going to use this line because this is our finished line. I've added this to the dash line as that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to run it right along here, and I don't have to necessarily keep it at 1.5 for this, but I do want to keep it pretty short just because I'm going to have to pull these papers back out and I do want that better perforation. So I might leave it at about, let's say 1.75, right? Make sure everything's lined up here. And I am still going to back stitch here. Now we have everything just perfect there. I'm going to sew this other one and I'm going to show you how I will pull my papers. We are going to pretend that I have pressed this. I'm just going to finger press it. Okay. So now when I go to this back side, a lot of times I use my fingernails to help me here, but you could also use a little pair of tweezers. I have a small kind of blunt tip pair that came with my serger to thread it, and I find that that works really well for foundation paper piecing. And I'm just kind of holding everything with my fingers and pulling this paper off. Okay. You're going to be better off to kind of work from the outside in. And by kind of helping and holding it with my nail in the beginning to kind of start that tear, I'm making it a lot easier for myself. Where these seams have gone over one another, I'm going to have some little bits in there, which sometimes that's when you're going to want to pull out the tweezers. And you see that's where I had my little glue dot, and it hasn't really caused me any problems just because I used a very small amount. It's coming right up. And I'm just working my way along. Now you don't want to leave large pieces of paper in your stitching, but if you have just a tiny bit like that, I don't really bother too much. Kind of scrape it with my nail. See that little tiny thing I'm not gonna worry about. And now we're ready to move on to the next step.